Good morning, everyone. I am here to present my presentation on attentional networks. To begin with, what is attention? Attention is a patient's ability to attend to a specific stimuli without being distracted by extraneous, internal, or environmental stimuli. Fan and Posner viewed attention as an organ system with its own anatomy and circuitry. Attentional systems can be defined under functional and anatomical terms. According to Posner's theory, three attentional systems are there. Number one is the subcortical system or the alerting system, which comprises of primitive and general level of arousal and alerting. Second is the posterior system, orienting. Second is the posterior system, which is concerned with orienting, direction of attention in a space based on sensory information. And third is the anterior system or the executive control, which controls the sustained attention to objects or events, select based on abstract information, and switch among the tasks. In this diagram, we have the anatomy of the attentional networks. The triangle is associated with alerting, that is the superior parietal lobe and right frontal areas. The square with the green dot has orienting, that is the temporoparietal junction, frontal eye fields, pulvinar, and the superior colliculus. And the circle with the blue dot has executive attentions, that is anterior cingulate gyrus and the prefrontal cortex. Coming to the subcortical system, which is also known as alerting system, and the locus coeruleus is activated following a warning signal. Hence, the drugs blocking the norepinephrine will decrease alerting, while drugs increasing NE will increase the warning signal. And the right hemisphere involved in slower and the tonic alerting, while the left hemisphere is involved in the rapid and phasic alerting. The posterior or the orienting system, it's a more dorsal system, including the frontal eye fields and interparietal sulcus. It is concerned with breaking the focus of attention on an invalid trial involved the temporoparietal junction. Anticholinergic drugs injected into the parietal lobe have large effects on the ability to shift attention. The temporoparietal junctions has been associated with perspective taking or thinking about the intentions of others and consequences to others. Anterior of the executive system. This system consists of two networks depending upon the anatomical region involved, the frontoparietal network and the cingulo-opercular network. Frontoparietal network, it consists of precuneus or medial cingulate cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, dorsal frontal cortex, interparietal sulcus, and inferior parietal lobe. It is associated with starting or stopping a task and moment-to-moment monitoring of tasks or resolving conflicts and task switching. Cingulo-opercular network concerns primarily the anterior cingulate and maintains the ongoing task of performance. Attentional network tests, they basically measure the efficacy of the attentional networks. The first is the flanker test for the executive system. In this test, there are two flanker arrows which are present on both right and left side of the central target. Flankers can be congruent, that is pointing in the same direction, and incongruent, that is pointing in the opposite direction. This is the flanker test, that is the arrows pointing in the same direction. Congruent trials with all arrow pointing to the right. Congruent trials with all arrows pointing to the left. And this is the incongruent trial with the middle arrow pointing to the left while all arrows are to the right. And in this, it is the opposite, incongruent trial with the middle arrow pointing to the right and the flankers to the left. Second is the Wisconsin card sorting test task. It is used to assess the perseveration Perseveration and the abstract thinking. It basically measures the executive functions, and it can be applied for the age of 5 to 89 years old. And the test takes around 15 to 30 minutes. And in a particular DLPFC lesions result in perseverative errors on the Wisconsin sorting task. So it is a Stroop task. It is basically for cognitive processing speed, attentional capacity, and the level of control. In this, we have the color and the font in a different. That is the color with the font color written, and there is a color inside the font. And it can be a congruent test. That is the word meaning matches the font color, and we say it is incongruent when word meaning doesn't match the font color. And this indicates a slower to respond, slow reaction time when the meaning of word conflicts with the font color that must be named. Another one is the Posner's queuing task. It focuses on the ability to prioritize sensory information by selecting a location or modality, measures the validity effect, that's invalid reaction time or valid reaction time, measures the cost of an invalid queue, and evidence that non-queued locations are actively inhibited. These are diagrams for the Posner queuing task. That it's a valid trial because the queue is indicating that the next dot would be here, and the very next moment the dot it is here. So it's a valid trial. Whereas in invalid trial, queue is indicating that the dot would be here, but it is on the left. So it's an invalid trial. Alerting task, it has vigilance task test concerned with tonic alerting. In this, the test subject is asked to press the buzzer whenever he sees flashing lights or the numbers on the screen. Another is the queuing task or the warning test, which is associated with phasic alerting. Attentional network test is useful in evaluating the attentional network abnormalities, mainly associated with ADHD, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, stroke, and other brain injuries. Attentional deficit hyperactive disorders appears to be related to dopamine pathways, mainly from the subcortical structures to the frontal lobes. It has the deficits in executive networks. Alerting network is useful to distinguish between different forms of ADHDs. Treatment is with Ritalin or methylphenidate, which elevates the symptoms. And the drug is a dopamine reuptake inhibitor, which increases the activity and thereby increases the inhibition. Schizophrenia, in this, highly significant defects are seen in executive networks, and smaller but significant defects are seen in orienting networks, and no deficits are seen in alerting networks. Borderline personality disorder, there are specific deficits in executive network. Talking about the heritability, as neuropsychiatric disorders are generally heritable, potential genetic factors may also influence the attentional networks. The executive network is highly heritable. Alerting network, modest heritability, and orienting networks are concerned with no heritabilities. Genetic analysis of attentional network tests serve as an endophenotype for genetic studies on attentional networks. It is the combining genetic analysis and fMRI is a promising approach to provide anatomical constraints on the roles of candidate genes that are implicated in various neuropsychiatric disorders. Drugs affecting the attentional networks, we have nicotine, withdrawal associated with reduction in vigilance. Nicotine improves the Stroop performance but reduce the orienting on attentional network tests. Second is the modafinil, which improves the attentional control via prefrontal networks and significant improvement in methamphetamine users. The third is the Adderall and Ritalin, improves symptoms in ADD or ADHD by increasing executive controls, primarily concerned with dopamine and non-epinephrine analgesic drugs. The last is marijuana. Its chronic use in adolescents associated more errors in executive controls, but fMRI showed increased activation and PFC for users. Show users had less efficient executive controls. And this last is a summary of anatomy and chemical modulators involved in alerting, orienting, and executive attention networks. In orientation, we have the superior parietal, temporal parietal, and frontal eye fields, and superior colliculus. Modulator is the acetylcholine. The second, in alerting, we have locus coeruleus, right frontal, and parietal cortex, concerned with norepinephrine as a modulator. And the third, we have executive attention, that is anterior cingulate, lateral ventral, prefrontal, and basal ganglia, having a dopamine as a modulator. These are the references. Thank you. So Dr. Sarthak helped me out. Not all. PPT was designed by me. Someone else PPT. So a bit of pieces is showing. Not totally honest. Not totally mine. So where is a reference of the person's PPT which you have taken? So this can be plagiarism. You have taken from someone's PPT. For point, you have to actually acknowledge the person. I would like to thank this person. Supposedly, you take my PPT and you put the 10 slides from my PPT. You go to write my name. I acknowledge this. I've taken some parts of this project. Please do that in a professional setup. Next presentation.
Sensorimotor. Good morning, everyone. I am presenting on the topic sensorimotor network. I am Dr. Molly and my moderator is Dr. Asma. What is a functional brain network? Brain areas are defined by their functional specific nature, connectivity, architectonics, and topographic organization. The functional interaction of the brain region comprising a network both within the network and with the rest of the brain led to the emergence of complex behavior that is slightly more than addictive of the discrete computation of each regional bit. Brain networks are characterized in graph theory as comprising nodes that are the brain regions and edges that are the connection. By the meta-analysis of fMRI, the taxonomy of functional brain networks are as follows. The occipital network, that is the visual network, the pericentral network, that is the somatomotor network, the dorsofrontoparietal network, that is the attention network, the lateral frontoparietal network, that is the control network, the salience network, and the medial frontoparietal network, that is the default network. My topic is sensorimotor network, also known as by the meta-analysis of functional MRI provides the basis for a claim that 6 networks represent a reasonable starting point for taxonomic reading. My topic is sensorimotor network. The first network is the occipital network, also known as the visual network. The second one is the pericentral network, also known as somatomotor network. The third one is dorsal frontoparietal network, that is the attention network. Then the next is lateral frontoparietal network, that is the control network. Then there is mid-insular network, that is the salience network. And the last one is medial frontoparietal network, that is the default network. Sensorimotor network is also known as somatomotor network or the pericentral network. Sensorimotor networks plays an essential role in completion of everyday tasks. Hidden beneath this often unappreciated ability is a complex system consisting of a primary controller, the brain's sensorimotor networks, which processes sensory information, generates motor plans. Then muscle activator sets the plans into motion. Sensory feedback element supplies a sensory motor network with information about task execution, and neuronal tracks that act as communication pathway between components. If any of these subsystems become corrupted, the successful completion of seemingly simple motor tasks becomes a fantasy. Parts of sensory motor network are the motor cortex, comprising of the precentral gyrus, premotor and supplementary motor cortex, the middle cingulate cortex, the somatosensory cortex, including the postcentral gyrus and the parietal cortex, the auditory cortex, including the superior temporal gyrus, the visual cortex, comprising of the occipital cortex and the associated dorsal parietal inferior temporal area. Then we have the pathways. The first pathway is the sensory pathway. From spinal cord, two important spinal thalamic tract arises. The first one is dorsal column, also known as the medial lemniscal system. And the second one is the anterolateral system. The dorsal column, it carries sensation like fine touch, stretchnosis, vibrational sense, proprioception, pressure sense, tactile localization, two-point discrimination. And the anterolateral, it carries sensation like, there are two anterolateral spinal thalamic tract. The first one is the lateral one, which carries sensation like pain and temperature. The second one is the anterior one, that carries a sensation like crude touch. By the dorsal column, the sensation like fine touch and proprioception, they are carried to the spinal cord. From there, in the medulla, they crosses over to the opposite sides, and through the midbrain and the thalamus, they go to the postcentral gyrus. The anterolateral tracts, they crosses over in the spinal cord only, and then they follow the path in medulla, midbrain, and then to the postcentral gyrus. Motor pathways. There are two motor pathways. The first one is the pyramidal tract, and the second one is the extrapyramidal tracts. The pyramidal tracts, they originate from the cortex and they goes to the spinal cord, and they comprises of two, the corticospinal tracts and the corticobulbar tracts. The extrapyramidal tracts are the vestibulospinal tract, the retrospinal tract, the reticulospinal tract, and the tectospinal tract. Here we can see the tracts from the motor area of the brain, like the premotor area, the supplementary motor area, and the somatosensory cortex. The pathway, they goes to the midbrain, and in the medulla, some pathways, they go anteriorly and they form the anterior corticospinal tract, and some goes laterally, forming the lateral corticospinal tract. The function of sensory motor network are processing external physical stimuli, feeling the internal sensation, evaluating the senses, and producing a motor response. Sensory motor network dysfunction. Mania and depressive phases of bipolar disorder show opposite psychomotor symptoms. Neurally, these may depend on altered relationship between the sensory motor network and the subcortical structures. In healthy individuals, the functional connectivity between the thalamus and the sensorimotor network reflect the communication pattern in the interesting activity of the thalamocortical sensorimotor complex, which plays a central role in sensory motor processing and behavior. In bipolar disorder, mania showed an increase in thalamus sensorimotor functional connectivity towards the positive value. By contrast, inhibited depression showed a decrease in thalamus sensorimotor network functional connectivity. These findings suggest an abnormal relationship of the sensorimotor network with neurotransmitter-related areas comprising of the subcortical loops in mania and inhibit depression, finally resulting in psychomotor alteration. There is an increase in thalamus sensory-motor network functional connectivity in mania and decrease in thalamus sensorimotor network functional connectivity in inhibited depression. Relationship of sensory-motor network and default mode network in mania and depression. Depression and mania phases in bipolar disorder shows opposite constellation of affective, cognitive, and psychomotor symptoms. They may be related to disbalance between the large-scale networks, such as the default mode network and the sensory motor network, data involved in these functions. The default mode network or the sensory motor network balance was tilted towards the default mode network in depression, which is characterized by excessive focus on internal thought contents and psychomotor inhibition, and towards the sensory motor network in mania, characterized by excessive focus on external environment content and psychomotor overexcitement. ALS and sensory motor network. The amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is a progressive neurodegenerative disease. Progressive disability in ALS is due to the muscular weakness caused by the degeneration of the upper motor neuron in the motor cortex and of the lower motor neuron in the brain stem and the spinal cord. Studies in ALS have reported that either low concentration of SMN connectivity in the premotor cortex or higher connectivity in the premotor cortex that is usually associated with the loss of white matter integrity in the corpus callosum and the corticospinal tract. SMN connectivity was found to be decreased with the between the bilateral frontal region of the brain, posterior region of the right middle temporal gyrus, and the SMN seat in association with higher symptom duration. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Munir. My topic is visual system, and moderator is Dr. Aditi ma'am. Uh, the eye is a fluid-filled sphere enclosed by three layers of tissues. The innermost layer is the retina. The immediate adjacent layer is the uvea. The eye is a fluid-filled sphere enclosed by three layers of tissues. The innermost is the retina. The immediate adjacent layer is the uveal tract. The outermost is sclera. The uveal tract is made of choroid, a ciliary body, and the iris. The function of various parts. Retina contains neurons that are sensitive to light and transmit the visual signal to the central target. Choroid is composed of rich capillary bed and nourish the retinal photoreceptors. Ciliary body, a ring of tissues that encircle the lens and that adjust the refractive power and secretes the aqueous humor. The cornea, a highly specialized transparent tissue that permits the light rays to enter the eye. How does image form on the retina? The normal vision requires the optical media of the eye to be transparent, both cornea and the lens. Alteration in the transparency can cause consequences for visual perception. Cornea and lens provide necessary refraction required for image formation on the retina. A lens has a less refractive power than cornea, but the lens refraction is adjustable, allowing the object at various distance from the observer to be brought into sharp focus on the retinal surface. We can see the accommodation in the human eye. When we are seeing the far objects, the ciliary muscles contract and the zonual fiber relax, making the lens more increase in curvature and thus accommodated. And in the nearby object, the lens is unaccommodated with relaxed ciliary muscles. Light rays after refraction form image on the retina, which is inverted. Light falling is transformed by retinal circuitry into patterns of action potential that ganglion cells axon convey to the visual center in the rest of the brain. Here is the central visual pathway. It starts from the retina and goes up to the visual cortex. First, we have the optic nerve, then the optic chiasma. It makes the optic tract, then the lateral geniculate body, optic radiation, and the visual cortex. The outer part is in the outer part in the eye is the temporal visual field, and the inner part is nasal visual field. The temporal field casts an image on the nasal part of the retina, and the nasal field casts an image on the temporal part. Now I'll be talking about the lesion in the central visual pathway. A lesion, it is in the right optic nerve. Right optic nerve, the right temporal fiber plus the nasal fiber are affected. So there is complete loss of vision, right ipsilateral enopia. In lesion B, the optic chiasma where the nasal fiber cross, there is a lesion. So the both temporal field will be affected. It is bitemporal hemianopia. In the third lesion, the optic tract, right-sided temporal fiber is affected and the left-sided nasal fiber which has crossed from the optic chiasma is affected. So the right-sided nasal field and the left-sided temporal field will be affected. Left homonymous hemianopia. In the D part, left inferior temporal fiber and the right nasal inferior fiber affected. So the right superior nasal field and the left superior field are affected. In the E lesion, visual cortex lesion, right temporal and the left nasal fiber affected. So the temporal and the right nasal field are affected. We'll be talking about visual hallucination. Hallucination is perception of any object in absence of external stimulus. Visual hallucination is of two types, simple and complex hallucination. Simple or non-formed hallucination include flashes or geometric shape or any lines or any other object. In the complex or formed hallucination, it shows object, faces of animals or any scenes. Mechanism of hallucination. De-afferentation responsible for pathway complex visual hallucination in which a de-afferentation from ocular input result in release activity. Disinhibition, loss of ascending inhibition to a geniculate result in hyperexcited geniculate and excess glutaminergic activity. Irritation of visual association cortex, Broadband area 18 and 19 cause visual hallucinations. Causes of visual hallucination, it can be of retinal pathology, visual loss, migraine, seizures, dementia, Parkinson disease, alcohol withdrawal, schizophrenia, and depression. Charles Bonnet syndrome, it refers to a phenomenon of visual hallucination occurring in patients with acquired vision loss. Visual hallucination in absence of psychosis, delirium, or any other cause. It is commonly confused with psychiatric illness, a common condition causing visual hallucination without mental illness. These are the reference.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Naveen, and I'm here to present my PPT on Salience Network, and my moderator is Dr. Astan. What is Salience Network? The Salience Network is moderator. As your mind's personal moderator, the Salience Network constantly monitors the external world and the internal chatter. It carefully decides how other brain networks reacts to new information and stimuli. The default mode network and neural network corresponding to daydreaming and central executive network corresponding to external response and cognition. The two primary control networks of the brain are switched between internally and externally by the salience network. What is neural circuit? Neuronal circuit is a population of neurons interconnected by a synapse to carry out a specific function when activated. Basic kind of synapse are electrical synapses and chemical synapses. Why is salience network important? Most of the diseases have been found to have some molecular biochemical basis for brain. Treatment is based on complaints and behavior challenge, complex structures and function of neuronal system. The salience network who plays a critical role in processing brain, pain, emotion, reward, and motivation in connection with the limbic system. In these cases, the moderator decides how much the human body hears signals involving emotional response. Where is the salience network? The salience network is primarily anchored at the anterior insular and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. The AI and DACC are linked via a white metal tract along the uncinate fascicles. As we can see in the diagram, default mode network is in medial prefrontal and lateral left lateral parietal, posterior cingulate, and right lateral parietal. And salience network is situated at anterior cingulate region and right anterior insular and left anterior insular. Salience network, as you can see, acts as a moderator between default mode network and central executor network. As we can take an example of a debate in which default mode network and central executor networks are speakers, and salience network act as a moderator between them. Studies have observed intrinsic connectivity of cortical nodes with subcortical nodes consisting of the amygdala, putamen, the ventral striatum, the dorsomedial thalamus, hypothalamus, and substantia nigra. Function of the salience network. It has been implicated in the detection and integration of emotional and sensory stimuli. In simple words, it selects stimuli that deserve attention. During rest, the activity of the network is maximum. It also acts as a switch between the internally directed cognition of the default mode network and the externally directed cognition of the central executive network. As you can see, default mode network have endogenously mediated self-referential mental activity, and self-network act as dynamic switching between DMN and CEN. And central executive network
act as exogenously driven, cognitively demanding mental activities. And there is an interesting fact about default mode network that LSD reduces activity of DMN, so that causes a psychogenic effect. It has also been hypothesized that the AI receives multimodal sensory input and the ACC and the associated dorsomedial prefrontal cortex sends motor out. Clinical significance of salience network. Dysfunction in the salience network have been observed in various psychiatric disorders, including anxiety disorders, PTSD, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, depression, ADHD, autism. In anxiety disorder, the AI node of the salience network has been observed to be hyperactive, leading to worrisome thoughts and anxious behavior. In schizophrenia, both structural and functional abnormalities have been observed. Patients have difficulty in shifting thoughts and result is hallucination. The network is hyperactive. Individuals with autism, the relative salience of social stimuli such as face, eyes, gaze may be diminished, leading to poor social skills. In ADHD, there is atypical connectivity between the DMN, which causes the patient to be easily distractible, attentional deficit, and decreased cognitive function. In Alzheimer's disease, brain activity decreases as the disease progresses. The neuronal activity and the DMN activity is decreased. In depression, the network is hyperactive, bringing in the depressive ruminations. That is, the thoughts are not goal-oriented and just keep coming. So modulations for the activity of DMN and SNR. The DMN can be modulated by antidepressants, attention training techniques, deep brain stimulation, meditation, physical activity, psychedelic drugs, psychotherapy, sleep deprivation, mindfulness. These are the references. Thank you. Any questions from you?
Everything else. That central executive network fashion.
I think all very well. Any questions? What is add-on from the first speaker? First speaker, I only read that few takes points from something actually like any technology. There's nothing bad in taking reverse connecting. And I think any questions specific Krishna will come to the comments. More of the more oriented. So, I think the reaction time is again the techniques quite other. some scoring patterns. If there is some deficit, then we can have some prognostic or some treatment. One more.
अगर इन पीरियड जाएगा तो वो superior contact करेगा वो पाए into ground जाएगा और जब जो illegal में जो एक implant जो mechanism होता है पूरे cortex को posterior cellular artery करके उस part में जो cellular artery supply करके इस वजह से करते हैं बहुत लोग
Can someone with congenital blindness develop hallucinations? Visual interesting. Later on, acquired blindness is होती है. Congenital chances of developing schizophrenia, congenital blind is almost nil. Almost zero. No one has reported till date. Why? Very interesting. He came late. Thought that we will scold you, but after presentation, yeah, we will illustrate the speakers. I think seniors can distribute the sectors. Ready. Okay, acquired conditions में fine. What about congenital blind? इसमें आपको कुछ दिखा ही नहीं है वो रिपोर्ट कैसे करेगा फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल की विजुअल ये हेलुसिनेशन विजुअल है वेरी गुड though a lot of people have given LSD in patients with visual blindness and try to see that whether they develop or very well. Do you mean that moderator like Sarthak is salience, speaker is an executive network, people who are in their dreams, and those in their default mode? Huh? Thank you. Start with the rounds.